Hello and welcome to MASHmouth, a podcast covering every single episode of hit 1970 sitcom MASH. I'm Ethan.
And I'm Vanessa.
Vanessa, today we have a very special treat because for the first time in a long time, we have new MASH content. On January 1st, they did a brand new special, reunion special with all of the remaining cast members and producers kind of discussing the show and how it changed television. So I wanted to get your thoughts on that. How do you feel about this brand new MASH reunion special?
I liked it a lot. I didn't think it was too much of a reunion special because the cast and crew weren't all in the same room with each other. So they weren't really riffing off of each other or anything like that, sharing memories. It was distinct interviews, individualized interviews with the cast and crew, which I thought was still good. It was a lot of recounting MASH's history, which I thought was fine, but that's also been recounted in other specials. Like the 30th anniversary special had a lot of overlap, I felt, with this one. But it was still really interesting to get the cast and crew talking about the show and having them recount those memories. Even if it's stuff that we may have heard before, I still really find value in it because it's such an old show. And I, of course, ate it up. I loved it.
Yeah, I agree with you that them not all being in the same room was slightly disappointing, but I enjoyed this just as a documentary on its own. This is something that even if I wasn't doing a MASH podcast, I would be interested in watching if it was a documentary that popped up on Hulu or Netflix, because I think it is a well-produced kind of little history lesson about the show, with these pretty interesting interviews from the surviving cast members, as well as archived footage. I thought it was very fun to listen to them talk about the show while having done it, so long ago.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think that what struck me too was, I think that certain interviews with the cast were recorded prior. I think it's some of archival footage from actually the 30th anniversary special, because I know that Larry Linville and McLean Stevenson had already passed at this time. But yeah, so I thought that interspersing that with the newer interviews with the remaining surviving cast members was a really good way to get more perspective on the show itself.
With how it was formatted, reminded me a lot of music documentaries that I watch a lot with my mom. There's a channel called Access TV. I don't know if it's a national channel, but they pretty much exclusively play retrospective documentaries on old rock musicians with archive interviews and some new interviews with whoever they can get. And this was really reminding me of that. And I really liked what was brought up here. I thought everyone who was interviewed for this, I thought they all looked great. I thought Alan Alda, we're all in our 80s, but, they all look great. Gary Berghoff looked like a really cool old guy. I don't know if you thought the same thing, but it was that's a guy who I can imagine, giving you the exposition in an action movie, I was just happy to see everybody. And I thought some of the stuff that was brought up was really interesting.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that struck me the most from this special was how the writers and the actors really cared about the storylines and the characters and just the show in general, how much care they took to make sure that the characters were properly portraying what they wanted to portray and that they were staying within character. I know that we had actually seen this prior in the 30th anniversary special when Alan Alda and Wayne Rogers would kind of go over scenes that were already done, and they would talk about what they could do better next time, or what would happen if one did something and the other did another thing a different way and stuff like that. And then what was new to me though in this kind of caring about the characters and stuff was when Loretta Swit said that she had to advocate for Margaret's character to kind of turn a new leaf and become someone other than Hot Lips Houlihan. I noted when I was watching it, I hated that she had to do that, but I loved that she cared so much about the character of Margaret to do that. And I think that, of course, it made for a better character and a better show, but I love that she took it to the next level of caring about who she was portraying.
Yes, I agree. The special is called the comedy that changed television. So a lot of it is about the writing and producing, like how the show was like special within the sitcom world. And what you said, how everyone really cared about the material, really stuck out to me. How Alan Alda signed on to the show because they like assured him it wouldn't be another like comedy at the front kind of show, which we talk about in our own podcast. So it was like fun to see that like reflected by Alan Alda in this like new interview, I believe. And with Loretta Swit, what stuck out to me with that specifically is that they were willing to adapt and change the show as it went on. That she was saying like, well, this Frank and Margaret bit was kind of already done by season 2. And I feel like a lot of even good comedy shows really don't want to change the status quo. And they were talking about it like they were very willing to like let a comedy concept kind of run its course and then do something new once that bit gets old. And I just really appreciated that. I was very engaged with the talk of how they like produced the show and like wanted to make something actually good rather than just another like network comedy.
I think that what made the show so good, thinking holistically about MASH, is that the writers took these chances and they did things like, you know, the commentary on war and stuff like that we cover all the time. But they also took these risks with these characters, too, to just like build them out a lot. And I think that they mentioned this also in the special, but they say that the audience could feel that. And I agree with that. And on that topic, too, of being willing to take the risks, I think that what really struck me that I hadn't thought about before was how the writers really pulled off an amazing show, even with several cast changes. Yeah. Because it was kind of like it could go either way. You know what I mean? They definitely were intentional when they wrote BJ's character to be completely different from Trapper. And I know that we had noted that when BJ first came onto the show, but to know that it was intentional just really goes to show how creative the writers were and how much they were willing to kind of break away from the traditional type of like sitcom type of show. Because I feel like a lesser show would have tried to just, okay, well, this works. Like Trapper as the sidekick and him being like X, Y, and Z way works. So we're going to try to recreate that. Instead of doing that, they took a whole new direction with it. And I really appreciated hearing that. And I also appreciated it as a viewer of the show.
Especially with it being like relatively later into the show's run, like replacing all these characters. They could have easily just done what you said, like have the same dynamics, but like clearly they were all interested in like continuing the show from a creative standpoint, not just like a monetary standpoint, you know? They recognized that like this situation still had, you know, gas in the tank, let's say, and rather than like rest on what worked before, they were willing to change it to give it something like fresh and new, while very rarely alienating the audience, which is such a balancing act. I thought that was so interesting to like hear about, you know?
Yeah, definitely. And I know that it was really funny when Mike Farrell was saying that he was really worried about the show tanking as soon as he got on, because he was going to have to wear that necklace around his neck forever, that he was the one who tanked MASH. And then I know from previous interviews and previous specials and whatnot, when Frank is replaced, the ratings like dipped a little bit, but they said that they always came back. And I think that just, again, goes to how good the show is. And one other thing that I thought was great that the writers, I think, pointed out was that the cast changes were actually this like blessing in disguise almost for the show, because it injected this new life into the show, because they had the characters who were already, you know, that the audience already knew and loved and whatnot. And you could kind of explore more with them. Their dynamic changed because they had to learn how to interact with this new character, who then the audience also gets to explore and navigate. So I thought that, again, that's a huge risk that they took, but I think that it really worked out for the show. And to know that it was intentional just goes to show how good the writers were with their thinking in this show.
Yeah, absolutely. They obviously talk a little bit about Henry leaving the show and like how his death was like a huge creative risk, and how McLean Stevenson was kind of like burned after leaving the show because he was like, oh, they all love me, but no, they didn't love me, they loved Henry. And like that's sad, but something that kind of put that into perspective for me with this documentary was that like they were talking about Henry leaving and McLean, like his show not working out, and they were saying like, well, it could have worked out, but he didn't have Larry Gelbart, he didn't have these other cast members. So it was more a case of like material not meeting McLean Stevenson's talent rather than McLean Stevenson's talent not drawing people in. Just that's something that like I appreciated in this documentary. It was a nice little appreciation for McLean, you know?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that was another thing that I enjoyed so much about this special itself, was that it focused a lot on the camaraderie of the cast and the crew and the writers and whatnot. Like I said before, the friendships that everybody developed, like Wayne Rogers and Alan Alda, and then immediately when Mike Farrell came onto the scene, Alan Alda and Mike Farrell had this same type of friendship because they recognized that it was just so necessary for the characters that they were playing, and that it had to kind of come across on screen too. I think that, I mean, it's good that they were also good friends, you know, in real life, but the fact that they took that care to be like, we need to portray this properly on the screen too. Just so good. Just great.
And I loved that they all still talked about the show with like such high regard, because it's so easy for like sitcom actors to kind of regret being those characters, to regret being like those buffoons for, you know, 10 years of their lives. But they clearly have such like admiration for the material that they were doing. Like we haven't really talked about this, but there's some like rumors that people like didn't get along with like Gary Berghoff on set and stuff like that. But one thing that I appreciate in all these reunion specials that we've seen, that the two we watched so far, is that like Gary Berghoff, even though more famously did not necessarily enjoy working on the show, still talks about it with such high regard. Like everybody kind of recognizes that this show is a good show. And I just appreciate that as a fan.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that what you said too is true about sometimes actors kind of regret playing certain roles because then they get labeled as those roles. But it just seems like everybody who participated in the MASH cast didn't have that regret. They even said that when they ended the show, that it was kind of like breaking up a family because they had such close ties. Because they knew that this show was so groundbreaking and so great and meant a lot to so many people, that I think that it seemed from the interviews they were appreciative that they could kind of put that content out there.
Yeah. I mean, with like Jamie Farr, I felt like Jamie Farr would be like the one guy who kind of regretted his position in the show, but he talks about it with such like reverence and like how unique that character was, that I'm just glad that he specifically is not, you know, regretful of being the man who wore a dress for maybe not 11 years, but like call it like 8 years of his life, that he still like saw the like value and comedy of that character. And like, I don't know, it's just nice to know that like the cast all know that this like means so much to people, that it's like a show that means more than just comedy and being silly, that they were saying something valuable with their time there.
Yeah. And speaking of that too, the thing that really stuck out to me the most, I know I said a lot stuck out to me, but this is my main takeaway from this special, was this story that Gary Berghoff told that was just, I actually cried because it really made me emotional, because Gary Berghoff said the greatest compliment that he received was a gentleman who had fought in the Korean War. He said that he was in the trenches in Korea and that he knew that he was changed when he came back home, but that he couldn't really express what he was feeling. He couldn't talk to his wife about the things that he went through. But when he sat down with his wife to watch MASH, he could finally like touch her arm and say, this is what it was like. And it kind of opened up that dialogue and that conversation. And I'm sure that it did so much for so many people. And I think that that just goes to show why media in general is really important and why MASH was important too, because seeing yourself represented on the screen is really important, and it can open up those conversations that can be really hard. And I love that this show did that for people. And I wonder if it was, if not the first, maybe one of the first of its kinds to really be that hard hitting, that it could open up that conversation for people who maybe were having problems talking about certain things before they watched this show. So yeah, that was just my favorite part of the entire episode.
That Gary Berghoff speech was really good. And I hope that was true and not like something he was, exaggerating for the documentary content. Because if that is true, that is such the heart of the show. Like in the beginning of the documentary, something that Alan Alda says that their like secret weapon was that like a lot of other shows don't have is that they're telling the stories about real people. Like all of these people in some way or another existed. And that, like, this show, despite being comedy, had the room to do something more with itself. And, like, it felt very validating for, like, the two of us, like, always overanalyzing it. And to know that, like, there are other people out there who, like, really deep dive into the show as well. And, like, that the material was written to be as, like, rich as it was. So, yeah. Good special. I think we all can agree. A quality time, a good 2 hours of our lives. It's always good to have new MASH content, and we'll take whatever we can get.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also think that it's funny because I told you to stop watching at a certain point because there are spoilers certainly for the rest of the show, the rest of even this season that we're on in season 4, there's some spoilers to be had. So I'm actually really excited for you to be able to go back and watch the rest of this special because it is very well done.
Yes, I'm excited to see the rest of it. For context, I have watched up to that Gary Berghoff speech. So I am interested in what comes next. I'm in the weird position of not wanting to have spoilers on a very, very old show. Like when it came on new, my mom watched it in the living room and I was just in my bedroom, like doing other things. It was quite funny.
I mean, hey, everything's new to somebody, right? So MASH is just new to you.
Wow, what a unique perspective I have. So this was a shorter one, but we wanted to take the time to talk about the special by itself. And with that, we'd like to give thanks to Jacob for about covering, our technical consultant, Melissa, Vanessa's sister, for cover art, and, of course, our listeners. Links to our music, social media, and contact for the show are in the description, as always, and join us next week for your regularly scheduled MASHmouth. Goodbye, farewell, and amen.
Bye, everyone.